It's 5 o'clock. A warm welcome to this online talk on how Europe can support Ukraine during the war with Russia. My name is Lykke Friis. I'm one of the co-chairs of ECFR. I also head the think tank in Copenhagen, Think Tank Europa, where here in Denmark we literally are just forming a new government, which, by the way, has put in its cabinet proposal that Denmark will now support Ukrainian EU membership. Today, on this very day, 27 years ago, the Dayton Agreement was signed in Paris. I'm sure that my fellow co-chair Carl Bildt remembers that. But talking about a peace agreement, one will have to say that the starting point for this talk is obviously that such agreement is far away. It's not in the cards in any way. We are now all looking into what will be a long war, and that will exactly also be the topic of this particular webinar. What can we do now that we are 10 months into the war to help Ukraine? Now that we know that it will be a long war. This opens a number of questions which we'll discuss. But before I introduce our panel, we go to London. We go to ECFR's director, Mark Leonard, and also co-founder, to tell us a bit about also what the ECFR is doing with regards to the long war. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Lykke. I'm thrilled that we're doing this event with an all-star cast, so I'll be very brief, but just want to talk a bit about ECFR and the long war and what we hope to do with it. And our starting point is two core assumptions. Firstly, that we need to be ready for the long term. Wars are unpredictable, anything could happen, but so far this has lasted much longer than Vladimir Putin thought it would do. And there are, I think, no immediate chances of having a negotiated end or a military victory. But also this is going to be a challenge which lasts for a very long time, the challenge from Russia, and the EU and Europeans need to be ready for the long haul. Secondly, we have to see this not as a single war in Ukraine, but we have to understand how the Russian strategy is for a multifaceted assault on the European security order and on a lot of the countries that live in Europe. And in ECFR, we're starting to think about this as what we call an omni-conflict. It's quite clear that as the Russians find it difficult to win militarily within Ukraine, they are expanding the way that they're fighting the war and trying to break the support which the West has shown for Ukraine. One of the ways by doing that is to try and provoke another refugee crisis. It's through the assault on energy bills, but we also are seeing the return of more familiar Russian tactics, from information campaigns through to attempts to stoke trouble in other parts of the world. So I think we need to be ready to preserve European unity and our societal resilience in the face of this omni-conflict. In the first phase of the war, there was an almost total confluence of interests between Ukraine, the transatlantic community, and amongst Europeans. And I think that unity was a big surprise to the Russians, was maybe even a surprise to some of us in the West. But it has been remarkable. I think it's one of the reasons why Ukraine still exists, coming on top of the extraordinary bravery and fighting spirit that we've seen from the Ukrainians. But I think in the future, it's going to be hard to preserve that unity, and we need to work much harder to do that. And that's really what our core project is going to be about. Our long war project is to think about how we can actually keep Europeans united, keep the transatlantic unity that we've seen, but also how we can couple the support that we need to give to Ukraine with a wider strategy towards Russia, but also of trying to make Europeans more resilient and better able to cope with a long-term omni-conflict from Russia. So our project on the Long War is going to be looking at this through three main prisms. Firstly, through this idea of an extended idea of regional security. We published, and that has various different elements. Starting obviously with what we do to help Ukraine. We published a paper called Survive and Thrive, which has got four main dimensions of things that we can do to help Ukraine, the security compacts, and we've done a lot of work looking at the whole question of security assistance, including the Leopard plan on tanks and other things, longer term security assurances, a project of economic support in the long term, including a partnership for enlargement, and also to think about how we can link Ukraine up with our energy and climate policies in order to allow the country to be viable. The second dimension of regional security, I think, has to be having a long-term approach to Russia. It's difficult to plan for all of the different scenarios, but I think we need to do it together as Europeans and to think about how we can get ourselves in the right place to deal with the challenge from Russia, which is going to be very different from the way that we thought about it in the past. It's very obvious there will not be a European security architecture that is designed with Russia. And we have to think about other ways of defending our security in the longer term. We've been working with the External Action Service to think about how we can create a platform for Europeans to think together about these issues. Another dimension of regional security is to think about what kind of frameworks we can have for cooperation with other countries. We've been doing a lot of work thinking about what can be done, particularly with the European political community, and are working with the three governments that are going to host summits in the future, the Moldovan government, the Spanish government, and the UK government, as well as other players such as the French government. And we want to sort of carry on our work on that. But I think maybe most challenging is the question of our societal resilience and making sure that we can both maintain support within the US, but within our own societies. And we're doing a lot of polling work and thinking about what kind of messages can work on that. So that's the first sort of dimension of our long war work. The second dimension is thinking more about energy and climate and how our energy transition moves forward, and that has both a kind of big intra-European element, but also has profound implications for our foreign policies towards other parts of the world. And that relates also to the third pillar, which is thinking about how a lot of the sort of second and third order consequences of our policies towards Ukraine are going to reshape the global economic order and our relationships with other countries, particularly developing countries, a lot of whom have been reluctant to support our policies on Russia in the past. We're going to pull together a strategy group to think about those issues. We're going to have a whole series of publications looking at different angles of it. We're going to bring together all of the regional programs of ECFR, as well as the work that we're doing on geoeconomics, on defense, and on energy and climate. We will carry on doing opinion polls, podcasts, and we want to help create a platform where different parts of Europe, north, south, east, and west, can come together and talk about some of the difficult issues in a safe space so that we can keep united, and we can remind ourselves that we have to carry on doing whatever it takes to make sure that we can help preserve the existence of an independent and democratic Ukraine, which is not just central for regional security, but I think it is increasingly central to the whole idea of European security, and it has now become, I think, the core unifying project of European integration for the years ahead. I will leave it at that because we've got so many fantastic speakers to go into some of these different elements, starting with the question of what we do to support Ukraine and our other partners in the neighborhood, such as Moldova.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mark. And it is now a great honor for me to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Tobias Lindner. Herzlich willkommen. Now, exactly a year ago, you became state minister in the German federal office, so in Berlin. And I'm pretty sure I'm not completely wrong when I say that you probably thought it would be a different first year in office. In December, I mean, nobody knew the term Zeitenwende. Now it's become lingua franca. I mean, just like Schadenfreude or Weltschmerz or whatever sort of word you like to think about. And in particular, it's also just now been called classified as the German word of the year. I just saw the other day. So now we obviously very sort of interested in how you look upon the next phase of the Zeitenwende, in particular now that we agree that it will be a long war. So what's the attitude with regards to that when you look upon the German policy? Where do you see the main challenges, and where would you also like to see more European action? So over to you, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon from Berlin, Excellencies, guests. It's a pleasure and honor speaking to you, and I could spend lots of my time about how we thought it would be in office and how it went out in the end. And you're totally right. Zeitenwende and especially Ukraine, these are the topics, usually the last topic in the evening before I go to bed, and usually the first topic in the morning when I stand up. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to give the keynote in front of such a pan-European audience today. And I would like to thank the European Council on Foreign Relations for organizing this event and for directing the focus on the duration and the lasting terms of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. When looking at the broad audience, I realized once more that the war mobilizes people from all professions and countries in their support for Ukraine. Almost 10 months after the beginning of the Russian aggression, the international support for Ukraine, may it be through military, humanitarian aid, financial or diplomatic means, remains unwaveringly high. And yet we even observe that global support for Ukraine keeps growing, while Russia loses more and more ground and also more and more of its supporters, even, to be honest, from its closest neighborhood. Working worldwide on the isolation of Russia is also an important part of our long-term support for Ukraine. Russia needs and has to understand that the international community will never tolerate this outrageous and blatant violation of international law, and we will hold President Putin and others accountable for their crimes. But what's the next step? Or in the words of today's conference, how can we help Ukraine survive the war and thrive again? The answer is quite easy and somewhat difficult at the same time. We have to keep standing united in all our efforts. It is through our unity that we have and that we will set limits to an imperialist and aggressive Russia. This is what the last months have shown and what the next months will be about. In the EU, the G7 and in NATO, we stood and must remain standing firmly and united, maybe more than ever in recent decades. United in providing a resolute response in NATO and on the alliance eastern flank especially, united in our massive support to Ukraine as allies, as EU and G7 members, and united in imposing unprecedented sanctions on Russia. That unity, ladies and gentlemen, surprised many, but no one should be surprised that we are firmly committed to keeping it up. With a view to a viable post-war peace settlement, together with Ukraine and interested countries and institutions, we remain ready to engage in long-term security commitments. We have a clear goal. Ukraine must win this war. And Kiev will determine the conditions for peace when the time has come. A so-called dictated peace from Moscow will be not acceptable. Moreover, in these dark winter days, we must be even more united in our support for Ukraine against the cold. Russia continues to target the energy infrastructure in the entire country with deadly precision, leaving millions of people without electricity, water, and heating. Russia's brutal and merciless behavior shows once more how little it cares about the fate of the Ukrainian people. Our priority right now is therefore to support Ukraine in getting through this winter and to ease the pain imposed by Russia on Ukraine's population. This was the central topic of yesterday's summit in Paris, to which Emmanuel Macron invited together with the Ukrainian President Zelensky, with the aim to discuss the most effective coordination for our immediate support. In the past month, Germany has already delivered spare parts. generators, transformators, oil heating systems. Today, Germany is one of the biggest humanitarian donors. We have already given 460.5 million euros on humanitarian aid since the beginning of the war, out of which 100 million euros are spent on specific needs for the winter. Inter alia, 300,000 mattresses and blankets, as well as winter clothes. 75,000 households will be provided with heating. Community shelters for around 44,000 people are being restored to cope with the winter. In Paris, our Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock announced additional 52.5 million euros of help for Ukraine's people to survive this winter. So please let me assure you that we work every day on ways to increase our immediate and humanitarian aid all over the federal government. We will stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. Russia must not succeed in terrorizing the Ukrainian population. And we are motivated and optimistic that we will succeed, because together with our partners in Ukraine, the EU and the G7, we are already thinking about the reconstruction of Ukraine, the Ukraine of the future. We are planning to establish an effective and inclusive process for our support for the long-term recovery of Ukraine, coordinating all efforts among international partners. We believe that if done well, the long-term reconstruction offers a chance for progress in the EU accession process, modernization, ecological transformation, and necessary reforms. We support Ukraine's wish to join the European Union wholeheartedly and see the candidate status as an important step towards this goal. This is, however, only the first step, as the road to accession is, as we all know, not an easy ride. Therefore, we support Ukraine in this process politically and technically. Together, we will stand with Ukraine as long as it is necessary to help it thrive again. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Keynote, Ukraine must win the war was one of your sort of clear statements. Thank you very much. Fröhliche Weihnachten nach Berlin. We'll now move on to the panel discussion. We have with us an excellent trio. So who do we have? We will soon have Radek Sikorski, member of the European Parliament, former Foreign Minister of Poland, where he was a colleague with speaker number 2, Carl Bildt, co-chair of ECFR today, but obviously former Foreign Minister of Sweden, also former Prime Minister of Sweden. And then we have from Kiev, and we are thrilled about that, Hanna Hopka, and we very much hope that the connection will be stable, because we know all about the challenges. We also all saw the news this morning about the explosions in Kiev, so we are extremely grateful that you are with us. You are now chairman of the Democracy in Action Conference, but you were previously member of the Parliament, in Ukraine, and you were also former head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Ukraine. So thank you so much for being with us. Remember, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions as we go along. But I think I'll start with you, Hanna. I mean, view from the ground, so to speak, but in particular also, how do you now look upon the prospects of a long war, and what was actually your reaction to the German intervention that we just heard? Over to you, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Lucky. When you said member of European Parliament, in your speech, I think it's really important that after candidate status, Ukraine received this June, we will progress with 7 commitments, and Ukrainian Parliament adopted just yesterday important Euro integration legislation to meet the requirements, the commitments. So actually one day, the representatives of Ukraine will become members of European Parliament. So I'm very optimistic on this. And of course, I'm very thankful to Dr. Lindner for his speech and the support we received from the European Union and Germany. And often I'm wearing the T-shirt with tanks Leopard and with request grant tanks for Ukraine. But since I'm too often wearing these T-shirts, and we also have T-shirts with grant for Ukraine F-16 and ATACMS, which we are wearing when we are in DC our International Center for Ukrainian Victory representatives travel into different capitals. And what I would like to say, it's really important that our partners finally understand that Russia is a failed state. Russia is a state sponsor of terrorism. Those entire identity is imperialism. So this is why defeating Russian imperialism and Ukrainian victory has geopolitical implication. And I just returned from Taiwan, South Korea. I visited this autumn with advocacy purpose. And actually, it's really important to understand that victory of Ukraine matters not just for the security of European continent. It's really important globally for democracy and preventing new wars from authoritarian regimes. And I think it's really important talking about the war situation and all Russian missile terror that has not changed and actually will not change the battlefield situation. The same like all Russian missile attacks on cities, on civilians, will not change the resilience of Ukrainian nation, because 95% of the population believes that Ukraine is winning and Ukraine will win the war. So this is why it's really important. The faster we receive the weapons we need, and the weapons like we need steady and timely supply of weapons, ammunition, and equipment to accelerate our inevitable victory. Mostly it's NATO standard weapon. And after great news about Patriots from the US, I think it's a time for another great news from Germany on Marders and tanks, modern tanks. Why it's important? Just 2 weeks ago, my best friend, Andriana Susak, was heavily wounded in the battlefield. She was, her husband were among the Ukraine defenders who liberated Kherson. And I think this is really important for us to provide Ukraine armor vehicles, which could help to save lives of the brightest and the bravest defenders of freedom. Because for us Ukrainians, why we are like asking for more military support, because it's about lives of the best people of our country, which after victory will be responsible for building our strong institutions, rule of law, prosper economic modernization of our industries, bringing innovations like Delta system, which we are now implementing our Ministry of Defense. So this is why you've seen the successes of Ukrainian defenders, which cleared of Russian invaders nearly half of the territory seized by Russia since the start of the full-scale war. And it's really important with more weapons coming faster to Ukraine, anti-air defense system, ammunition, modern tanks. Also, let me also ask about tougher sanctions. And strengthening sanctions is needed to ensure that Russia is not able to manufacture and maintain high-tech weapons, missiles attacking civilians and critical infrastructure. And also, it's important to impose tougher sanctions on energy industries and energy companies like Rosatom. And we do believe that United States will also recognize Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, and Wagner Group will be recognized as a terroristic organization. And confiscation, after the recent decision of European Parliament and another resolution on a tribunal, we will see some progress on confiscation, because it's important to support financially Ukraine using Russian money and send clear signals to different Russian groups that this war will be at the expense of Russian economy, and this will be tougher, because sanctions imposed by the US and the European Union against Russia undoubtedly undermine its economy. but they do not affect the reduction of Russian aggressiveness. So this is why the sanction policy should also include banking sector, military industry, individuals like Kirill, the KGB leader of Orthodox Church, Mr. Gundyaev, and many others. So I might stop here because for me it's really important to hear the questions from our audience, but just to tell you that the fighting spirit, ordinary Ukrainians, our defenders are so high. So we will really continue do our best to win faster. We believe that Crimea is an achievable goal for next year. And it's really important that every inch of Ukrainian territory, every inch, will be free from Russian occupiers, from Russian genocidal war. And it's really important to liberation of all kidnapped Ukrainians, kids, and with international tribunal, reparations, and of course, security. I don't like this word assurances. Let's talk about real security guarantees. And I mean NATO membership. And we are very optimistic on the next year NATO summit. And also, it's really important that victory of Ukraine is crucially meaningful for other democracies, especially in Asia and Indo-Pacific region.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll make sure that I send you a T-shirt at a certain stage. I'll soon be members of the European Parliament because you definitely deserve a T-shirt like that. Carl, and welcome also to Radek Sikorski. Over to you, Carl. There is the European Council taking place tomorrow once again. What would you say would be the most important message from that European Council now, considering that we are looking into a long war? What are your expectations with regards to that? Over to you, Stockholm.
Someone said to me that Radek was somewhat short of time. Is that still the case, Radek?
He's here. And he will be here the entire time.
If you didn't take him before. But otherwise, I will go. Yes, the European Council tomorrow, Ukraine is on the agenda. I think there will be a discussion on a number of different items. There are some difficulties still with the very complicated issues of gas prices and oil prices. That is the G7 discussion on oil or decision on oil price cap. That's not an easy thing to get to operate. There are disagreements on a gas price cap. There are questions whether that is workable at all, but I think they will do that. One thing they will do is that they will reaffirm what was decided at the General Affairs Council on, I think it was yesterday, as a matter of fact, when the General Affairs Council had its annual discussion on enlargement, and preliminary conclusions were made. It's an interesting twist there when it comes to Ukraine and the accession perspective, that one opens up for sort of a speedier process when it comes to getting Ukraine into the single market. This might not be the thing that is the uppermost at the agenda at the moment, but it means that preparations are now started for something that's different and it's speedier than what we've done with other accession countries. Otherwise, what I would hope, but don't know, and think still somewhat unlikely, I have to confess, is that we start reorienting the entire discussion towards a somewhat longer perspective. If we go back to February, when it all started, I think the expectation certainly of the Kremlin, but I have to say in large part of the West was as well, that this was going to be over in a couple of weeks. Then there was the expectation this was going to be over in a couple of months. And a lot of the support that was decided upon directly or indirectly with that particular time perspective. Now we know this is going to take quite some time. There's no peace in sight. Winning the war, however you define that, is got to be a long stretch. So we need to devise policies, I would say, in a 2-3 year perspective at least. And that has implications for what we do in the military side. So far, we've been sort of giving the weapon systems that's been available. So it's been must have been a pure logistic nightmare for the poor Ukrainian army in that particular, but better than the alternative, as to be said. but we now need to think, particularly in terms of munitions and ordnance of different sorts, to get production contracts out to our different industries so that they can produce, and this is going to take some time. That's not only artillery ammunition, which is beginning to be a critical factor, but also when it comes to air defense. For example, these missile systems coming in, the IRIS-T and the NAMS, they are dependent upon the supply of missiles. That is not going to be very easy to sustain at present rates of fire unless we get production rolling again. Then what is less in focus, but at least as important, is the financial support. The EU now decided on the $18 billion. That's fine. We for next year, I think more will be needed, euros to be precise. And we now see that support from Europe, military and financial, is now above support of the United States. That wasn't the case in the beginning, but of course this is a conflict in Europe, so this is fairly natural. But we need to understand how essential this is to maintain the functionality of the Ukrainian state, education, health system, taking care of all the people who don't have any roof over their head, repairing the electricity system. The Ukrainian state income has gone down. The Ukraine economy is down 35-40%. So it is absolutely vital that we are there in order to be able to finance the Ukrainian state so that it can continue to uphold the basic state functions. That is a precondition for winning this particular war. And then also, needless to say, the political support in different fora around the world. Much has been said about that. The global south, or however you defined it, much more needs to be done. Then when it comes to beyond that, then it's a question of, after not only winning the war, but winning the peace. And one should be aware of the fact that there's a difference between a pause and a peace. If we win the war but lose the peace, it is just a pause before the war resumes. And here, of course, the stability of Ukraine is key. The stability of Ukraine is the stability of Europe. And three processes will be critical. The reconstruction, fairly obviously. That's a physical reconstruction. That's got to be expensive, to put it very mildly. Numerous aspects to that. The reform process, which is primarily political, primarily but not only, relates to Ukraine. And then the reassurance process, of how we want to define that, which is primarily military. Building a new military for Ukraine that can provide it with the security and the assurance that's going to be necessary in the future. The task for us Europeans would be to tie together the two first elements, I would say, the reconstruction and the reform process, to make that one process the one way or the other. This is a tricky thing and needs to be devised carefully so that it's not only the reconstruction, fiscal, and not only the accession perspective, but to bind them together so that we try to build or create the conditions for the Ukrainians to build a different and a better and a new Ukraine. All of these things, as said, to go back to what I said in the beginning, need to be thought through in the longer term perspective. We've all been doing ad hoc policies for a couple of, or for 10 months by now. It was weeks, that was the perspective in the beginning, now it's been months. We now need to have the longer perspective. I would say every measure should be taken with the perspective of 2-3 years for a start for winning the war, and then for even longer perspective, probably decades, for winning the peace, and understanding that winning that particular peace with all what that implies is absolute precondition for peace and stability in Europe as a whole for decades to come.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And a nice Swedish Christmas decoration you have behind you there. Radek, now we go to you. Feel free to comment on what you've heard so far, but I can already see here a question coming, which basically refers to the fact, how optimistic you are with regards to maintaining the unity among the European member states. There's a reference here to Italy, where some political forces are very skeptical about whether it's possible to maintain basically the support. But over to you, and make sure that you keep on asking the questions, because we already have a number here. Radek, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for doing this again. Oops, we need to unmute you just a second. Oops, let's see.
Thank you.
Yes, now we can hear you loud and clear. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for the invitation, and apologies for being late. I'm in Strasbourg. I had to speak on the floor of the House, where actually on foreign interference in democratic processes, of which we have plenty. It's hard to improve on Carl's characteristically brilliant presentation, so let me just add a few footnotes. I don't think this war will end anytime soon for the following reason. If Putin wants Ukraine to remain non-aligned, he would have to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. If the West wanted Ukraine to cede territory, we would have to reassure Ukraine that that would be the last concession. In other words, we would have to give Ukraine NATO membership. And neither of these things is likely, because they're just too difficult for everyone. So the war will continue until something gives. Either the West stops supporting Ukraine, unlikely, or the Ukrainians make concessions, unlikely, or there are rebellions in the Russian army, or Putin is removed, hopefully. I was recently in Washington chairing the delegation of EU-USA, and I was briefed by senior officials from the Commission and the External Action Service. European help to Ukraine is much bigger than we are being given credit for. Remember, we're not comparing like with like. When we calculate the EU contribution, we should calculate the contribution of the European institutions and of its member states. Because in the United States, it's only Washington. And I am told that the total for all on our side is 20 billion this year. And we have already pledged 18 billion as European institutions for next year. And we've actually voted it through. And when you add the military and non-military contributions by member states, that will be a huge amount of money. I will end with the unity of Europe, but let me just say that that Republican voters are going wobbly on supporting Ukraine, much less so than Democrats. And what is particularly worrying is that because Republicans have such a tiny lead in the House of Representatives starting in January, they are apparently pledging themselves to be almost unanimous for anything to go to the floor of the House. They're having difficulty with actually choosing a Republican speaker. And that means that President Biden will next year have to make concessions and make difficult compromises in order to secure authorizations for both financial and military assistance for Ukraine. And I understand that he's trying to front load it right now so that it's passed by the lame duck session, but it still means that in about a year, it might be more difficult to get more American money for Ukraine. Now, at the European end, I think Putin is surprised again how much unity we have shown. I'm surprised how much we've done. I thought that we would be lucky to get the SWIFT ban, and instead we've frozen Russian assets, much bigger sums than in the US, by the way, because the Russians had moved their funds to Europe. And the European Union is buying arms from the wonderfully named peace facility. which I'm told is almost depleted. We need to multiply our defense budget and the peace facility. Of course, I have no crystal ball as to what Italy or Portugal will do. And of course, if I were Italy or Portugal, I wouldn't feel physically threatened by Putin. Unfortunately, the European Union does not consist of 28 Polands. But I hope everybody recognizes now that Putin has broken important European taboos and is a threat to Europe as a whole. And so far, I've been much impressed by our response, but clearly we need to do more. The candidate status for Ukraine now has to be supplemented with the opening of negotiations, and the pre-accession funds, plus the cohesion funds, plus the frozen Russian assets. That will be the Marshall Plan for sustaining and then rebuilding Ukraine. Thank you.
And Rade, just to follow up on that with regards to enlargement, because you've been very vocal on that. I mean, years ago already saying that we should have done this, with regards to candidate status. I mean, now it's happening. It happened in June. But what kind of enlargement process do you actually envisage? Is a new kind of enlargement faster, speedier? I mean, ECFR is pleading for an enlargement partnership where you basically say that you should already now take Ukraine into the single market. What's actually your take on that?
Well, I closed the association agreement with Ukraine during the Polish presidency, and if it had been proceeded with swiftly, we might have avoided this war, because I think the Russians used the 18 months that it took us to understand what it's about and how civilizationally dangerous it was for them. So, just the process of checking by lawyers and interpreters and then ratification takes years and months. The Ukrainians have, through their sacrifice, their bravery, their defense of Europe, have got this, the opening of the candidate status. We now need to open negotiations. Out of friendship, I tell them the unvarnished truth about what the so-called negotiation process involves. And it's not a negotiation in the sense of give and take and coming to some kind of middle position. Because not a unification between the EU and Ukraine, it's Ukraine's accession to something that already exists, with a huge body of laws that are an outcome of thousands of sometimes ugly compromises. So I think it's useful sometimes to shock people to get through. So I tell them that it's actually a voluntary Anschluss. You can negotiate about the speed of your adjustment to EU laws. That's about it. And the fewer illusions you have, and the faster you do it, the faster you will be members. And this is going to be a really humiliating and unpleasant process. The prize is worth it. But essentially what you need to do is to take the 80,000 pages of European acquis, translate it into Ukrainian, and pass it in your parliament. And then you can be members by the end of the decade. But you also need to explain it to your people that that's what you're doing, because otherwise you will get an echo like we are getting now in Poland, where we were not told that this is what it involves, but it's clear to anybody who knows about it. So my suggestion to our Ukrainian friends and allies is, don't waste your time anymore like you did for 25 years after independence. Bite the bullet and do it fast. And then I hope we'll be able to greet your MEPs here in Strasbourg at the end of the decade.
That's the plan. Let's maybe just hear Hannah's comment on that, but I also have a number of questions for you, Hannah. So, and I have also some for you, Carl. But let's start with Hannah from Alexander Slavinsky. What are the things the West sort of keeps forgetting when talking about the needs of Ukraine? What are the factors that are often overlooked by politicians and societies in the West? For example, Alexander says he's heard that there's a significant lack of glass needed for producing windows that was destroyed during the bombings, and here the West could help with regards to that. So are there other examples with regards to that? So what do we not know? What should we know about the situation in Ukraine? Then there is a specific question also for you concerning what the United States should do with regards to patriots. I mean, the news that came out has not been confirmed, but that's now being considered. What's your point of view with regards to that? So these two questions, but maybe you could also comment on Radek's point of view with regards to enlargement. You don't necessarily have to use the term voluntary Anschluss, but I mean, his point was very clear about that you have to basically take over the legislation now and not wait for the EU. So over to you.
So let me be very clear, because in Ukraine, we have a victory strategy, which combines one, defeating Russian military and return back Donbass and Crimea, and actually this is internationally recognized 1991 borders. And also after military defeat of Russia, like a part of post-victory agenda, which besides recovery, reconstruction, international tribunal. So, but regarding the current situation, the sooner we reach parity with Russia on heavy arms, the faster the war will end with Ukraine's victory. So this is why I think it's really important for international transatlantic community and Rammstein coalition to keep helping us with military for like current, medium and long term perspective, which we also have to consider the investment joint project in military industries. And one of also important issue for us, it's Russian military continue militarization of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Additional MLRS system have been stationed near reactor number 6 and the dry storage fuel area. So the occupiers must leave the plant and Ukrainian authorities have to regain full control of it. Russian nuclear industry must be sanctioned to prevent a precedent for other nuclear terrorists. So there are like important steps when we have to be prepared for operation of demilitarization of nuclear power plant, also investment in training our armed forces, and I'm very thankful for European countries, for UK, US, for helping to train our soldiers abroad. But on all these conversations on like peace talks or others issues, I think it's really important to understand it's 10 months of genocide, a full-scale war, but it's 9 years when Russia invaded Ukraine, broken in the international order and global security architecture. So we in Ukraine only like defeating Russia, then we could start peace talks, and as Dr. Lindner said, that Ukraine will determine the conditions to get, and it's really important to keep in mind. On EU membership, and after the Orange Revolution, we expected, at that time I was a very young student, coming from Lviv to Kiev, Maidan, protesting and saying Yushchenko, tak. Then there was Dignity Revolution. For all this, more than 31 years after the Soviet Union disintegration in 1991, Ukraine, unfortunately, wasn't considered as a partner So for many our partners, we were like a buffer zone. So this was also one of the mistakes. Remember the Bucharest NATO summit, when the key decisions for Georgia and Ukraine, without this decision and the weaknesses of the West, was considered by Russia as a way to go attack Georgia 2008, then Ukraine, then Syria with chemical weapons in Aleppo, and many others. I could mention Salisbury, I could mention Venezuela, I can say about Wagner Group in Mali, in the Central African Republic, and many others. So this is why I think victory of Ukraine as a successful story or success story of collective West, it's a best deterrent strategy, preventing authoritarianism to go further. Because what's happening now in Ukraine, this is like mafia club, Russia, Belarus, Iran with kamikaze drones, China, North Korea, all of them united just to help Russia to destroy Ukraine. So this is why the faster we win, the more benefits, like no inflation, no division among NATO partners, no polarization in Western societies, no energy deficit, so no global hunger threat, because Grain Deal is a temporary decision. It's not about freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. Let's be honest. Remember, in 2021, the Royal UK Defender, when he in the Navy in the Black Sea, was very provocative for Russia in the Black Sea. So we need democracy really being equipped with modern NATO standards weapon, proactive sanctions, and real plan. Because we in Ukraine, we have victory plan. I would like to ask our NATO partners, US, do you have a victory plan for Ukraine, how to win faster? Do you have a real strategy on Russia or post-Soviet space and strategy on China? Because all of this interconnected. Defeating Russia in Ukraine is in China. Because I heard also some statements, let's stabilize Ukraine and start focusing on China. No, it's wrong approach. After failure in Afghanistan, now not to help Ukraine to win faster and now refocus on China would be a biggest mistake. Because China is in very sophisticated manner using economic expansion, but trying to have global authoritarian dominance. So we have to keep in mind, without victory in Ukraine, to prevent China from attacks will be impossible.
Excellent. So what's our victory plan, actually? And we have here from Gustav Gressel from European Council of Foreign Relations reminding us all that the tank issue is extremely important with the new Russian offensive taking place in the spring. So new weapons, NATO tanks are needed. And then we have the question here from Yuri Albrecht asking Karl and Radek, how could we persuade Germany to do more, to become more involved, to convince them to really shoulder their responsibility on the military assistance of Ukraine, he asks. So maybe I should start with you, Radek. How can Germany be persuaded to do more? I presume you agree with the premise in the question. Over to you, and then Karl afterwards.
I had discussions with senior German politicians recently at the sort of subgroup of the Munich Security Conference. And what worries me is that the Germans have announced that they're going to spend 100 billion on their own defense. And 9 months have passed, and apparently they have not yet spent a single euro on their own defense. They claim that they are the second or third largest contributors to the to Ukraine in military terms. Of course, it looks much worse in on the per capita basis. I would like to know more about what the German contribution is. But I think there is strong resistance in the business community, in the ruling Social Democratic Party, to doing what Chancellor Scholz announced. I think they are still hoping to going back to business as usual, and they seem resistant to my argument that yes, you can go back to business as usual, buying Russian energy. We just need to win this war. Once we've won the war and Putin hopefully falls and we have a post-Putin regime, then we can start having more normal relationships with a post-Putin Russia. So it should be in your interest to bring it about as quickly as possible. The Germans seem to be moving in the right direction, but just like during the financial crisis with the Eurozone and Greece, it's far too slow. And we are frustrated, but we need to persevere. There's no other way.
Carl, the German question. So can we do something, I mean, to persuade them to speed up the process? First question. Second question. Sorry? Yes?
Continue with the second question. What was that?
The second question is whether you could elaborate a bit more on what you mean by winning the peace, as you said. How do you think the end state of this war could look like from this perspective?
I mean, let me first give you the figures, because I think it was alluded to already. The overall figures now is that the Americans have committed financial and the way they count the military. That's a question of exactly what they do, what's included in that. 48 billion euros. That's a hell of a lot of money. EU money, and that's not EU institution plus European countries, that includes the UK, by the way, is 52 billion. And that was really the big package the other day from the European Union of 18 billion that tipped it over, that the European contribution is now bigger than the US contribution. Add to that, of course, there is contribution roughly 13 billion euros from other countries. Japan should not be forgotten in this particular case. On the bilateral, it is worth noting, and this is the Kiel tracker, which is the most established sort of tracker of these things. Germany is now the biggest. Germany is past the UK. UK was big at the beginning. Now it's Germany that is the number one. On the German contribution, otherwise, I'd like to defend them somewhat, because it becomes sort of a European sport to sort of beat up on the Germans. They have delivered so far the most effective air defense weapons. The Gepard anti-aircraft tanks, I mean, there's been a problem, I don't know if that's been resolved, with ammunition supply from Switzerland, but has proved extremely effective. The Irish T system has a 100% record in all engagements. Now, these are very advanced systems, and we have ordered them to the Swedish army. They're not yet in service here. I think the German army doesn't have it in service as of yet, but there's one, and there's 3 more coming. So that is the most advanced air defense equipment that is in place in Ukraine. They have delivered, I think, nearly 20 of their hugely effective Panzerhaubitze. I understand that a third of them are now in Slovakia because there's so heavy use of them, and there's been problem with training and whatever, so they need repair. But it's quite substantial. Can more be done? Certainly. More can be done by all of us, Sweden included. 35,000 Swedish origin anti-tank weapons have been delivered. I didn't know that we had as many as we have delivered, as a matter of fact, and as a matter of fact, we don't anymore. But we are running up, we should be realistic, we are running up against real constraints in terms of training, in terms of repair facilities. A lot of the howitzers that have been developed, have been delivered, have been overused and must go back for repair. We don't have repair facilities enough. Logistics is how you win wars. So more needs to be done, absolutely. But I don't think we should let the debate be as simplistic as it sometimes has been. Patriot batteries coming in, excellent. That's an extremely expensive system. And that means that the number of actual missiles to be fired aren't that many. I would say good that Patriots are coming, but we need more of their defense systems where we can afford to shoot sort of 20 or 30 or 40 engagement a day. You can't do that with the most expensive systems. That's a brutal military reality. End state, Lykke. Well, at the end, we're all dead. Hopefully, we'll see peace before that. End state for Ukraine is membership of EU, and it's got to be NATO the one way or other. End state for Russia, which is not an end state, but is the post-Putin Russia that has decided that it's got to be a nation state and not an empire. And it's only when that has been done that Russia can live in harmony and cooperation with all of its neighbors, and notably with Europe at some point in time, even with Ukraine. But as I said in the beginning, I think we are talking quite a long time until both of these conditions, the essential conditions for what we can call peace, have been achieved.
Thank you. And Radek, how long is the long war? How long will this last? Because this is obviously and also something that we need to speak about. First question. Second question comes from Barry Posen, who asks basically the following. Supposing Ukraine manages to liberate its lands in the next 2 or 3 years, what sort of relationship between the transatlantic alliance and Russia seems plausible? Over to you.
I can't predict the course of the war. I mean, I wish I could. But clearly, both sides are not yet sufficiently exhausted to either to capitulate or to accept unfavorable terms. And so Ukraine needs to impose mounting costs on Russia for the Russian people and the Russian elites finally to take a new look and to see whether the neo-imperial project is worth it. And only then will we see some decisions. There could be, surprises on the battlefield. But we have to just wait for events. Was the second question to me as well?
Yeah, basically the relationship with Russia afterwards. I mean, the day after. How can then the relationship develop between the transatlantic alliance and Russia is the question here.
Russia has excluded itself from the family of responsible nations. I think Russia's seat on the UN Security Council should be debated, given that there was never a vote in the UN to assign the Soviet Union's place to Russia. Russia is going to be degraded and weakened for at least a decade, because I think the sanctions will continue until there is some kind of treaty or amends are made to Ukraine, and that will take years. My old friend and mentor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, said that Russia's choice is between being an ally of the West or a vassal of China. Putin made the wrong choice, favoring his own personal interest of staying in power rather than the interest of his country. And I hope a post-Putin leader of Russia makes a different choice. But it'll be years before there is a transition. I mean, could happen quickly, but it could take a long time. As a result of which, I think the Russian Empire as an idea will be dead, and Russia might become more cooperative with the West if she suffers a catastrophic defeat, which I'm hoping for. The Russian elites really have to internalize the fact that reconquering an empire by a European state is simply not acceptable. They've taken on the whole Western world, and they can't win this. So you would have to have a fundamental reappraisal in Moscow of its relationship with the West for us to invite Russia back. You know, I've debated Mr. Mearsheimer and other so-called realists who claim that, oh, if only we'd been nicer to Russia in the 90s. But we were nice. We invited Russia to the G7. We invited her to the Council of Europe, WTO. We were negotiating an association agreement with the EU. I've already mentioned the UN Security Council, billions of euros for housing Soviet troops, for macroeconomic assistance under Yeltsin, which was mostly stolen. We were bending over backwards to be nice to the Russians. You know, NATO-Russia Council, and they've trampled all the principles of all these organizations underfoot. I want to see that Russia, you know, is a country that can abide by any rules, you know, respect its own pledges, such as under the Budapest Memorandum, and it will take some time and some painful decisions for Russia to convince me that they are serious.
Carl, you did a very good job in sort of explaining the German position, more or less also defending the German position. What about Macron? Could you help us out on that one? Basically, what was his point about the recent statement that Europe needs to give guarantees to Russia the day it returns to the negotiation table? What's your take on that? How do you explain his position there? Or was it taken out of context?
I don't know if it was, because I didn't see the origin of the text. What I did see is that he, the day after, did a tweet, which was quite remarkable, where he said full support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And the word territorial integrity is important. I mean, if you look at the Biden statements, territorial integrity is never there. So he went, and he's also gone quite far, comparing, said, see, us French, we lost Alsace-Lorraine or Alsace-Lotterie to the Germans in 1870. We never gave up, and we got it back. So he's used that. But sometimes he goes into these sort of statements that were either deliberately sort of vague, deliberately in the effort to attract some Russian interest, or just taken out of context. I don't know. But I was positively surprised by that particular tweet that he did the other day, which I said went further than what we've seen from the American side.
Hannah, Carl and I, we were just in Warsaw. It was pretty cold, at least compared to Copenhagen here. I'm not sure about Stockholm, but for me as a Dane, it was cold.
I apologize.
And when you sort of go to Warsaw, you definitely also start thinking about how cold this is in Kiev. And the big debate, obviously, was also, I mean, will we see a new wave of refugees? I mean, is that happening? Or you spoke about the resilience and so forth, but I mean, it must be a very, very difficult situation. Could you just say a few words about that before I end with a question on the European political community? Over to you.
Okay, thanks. It's very important, but I think the key is here. Security and more weapons, and the armed forces of Ukraine successfully retaking our territories is a key. Because I also don't want that we shift attention and buying generators and focusing on all. It's really important, but the problem is, because in June, during my visits to Washington, Brussels, we were predicting and saying about this Holodomor, that Russia weaponized winter and freezing Ukrainians as and changing tactics. And actually, when the war will be in everyone's home. So we were, with all our policy papers at National Security Council, Congress, asking, give us more anti-air defense system right now, because in autumn, Russia will start deliberately attacking energy critical infrastructure, heating system. And the next will be the state reserves of agriculture.